The macabre history of the Cardells. They raised 11 kids without IDs, names, or school records in the summer of 1987. A social worker named Margaret Chen received what seemed like a routine call. A neighbor in rural Montana had reported strange sounds coming from an isolated farmhouse, children's voices, but no children were ever seen playing outside. What Margaret discovered that day would haunt her for the rest of her career and expose one of America's most disturbing cases of systematic family isolation. The Cardell farmhouse sat at the end of a dirt road, 23 miles from the nearest town of Willow Creek, population 847. The property stretched across 42 acres of barren land, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to swallow sound itself. No mailbox marked the entrance. No power lines connected to the main grid. For nearly 2 decades, this place had been home to 13 people who, according to official records, didn't exist. Thomas and Ruth Cardell had purchased the land in 1969 using cash and a false identity. Thomas, a former military medic turned survivalist, believed society was heading toward inevitable collapse. Ruth, a woman who had grown up in extreme religious isolation herself, shared his conviction that the outside world was corrupted beyond salvation. Together, they created what they called the sanctuary, a place where their children could grow up pure, untainted by what they saw as the moral decay of modern America. But purity, in the Cardell household, came at an unimaginable cost. The first child was born in 1970. Ruth delivered the baby herself, with only Thomas assisting. No doctor was present. No birth certificate was filed. No name was officially recorded. The child, a girl, was simply called firstborn for the first 7 years of her life, until the family eventually settled on calling her Anna, though this name existed nowhere in any government database. This pattern continued for the next 15 years. 11 children were born to the Cardells, each delivered in the same bedroom, each brought into a world where they would remain legally invisible. The children were numbered in order of birth and given simple, biblical-sounding names that held no legal weight: Anna, David, Sarah, Michael, Rebecca, Joshua, Mary, Benjamin, Rachel, Samuel, and finally, Ruth, named after her mother and born in 1985. The isolation was methodical and complete. Thomas had constructed the farmhouse himself, using salvaged materials and ensuring it remained hidden from aerial view by strategically planted trees. Solar panels, installed long before they became mainstream, provided minimal electricity. A well-supplied water. Gardens provided vegetables, and livestock provided meat and dairy. The family was entirely self-sufficient, exactly as Thomas had planned. Education, if it could be called that, consisted of basic reading and arithmetic taught by Ruth using outdated textbooks Thomas had acquired from abandoned schools. The children learned to read using a King James Bible and an encyclopedia set from 1962. Their understanding of the outside world was filtered entirely through their parents' paranoid worldview. They were told that beyond their property lay a wasteland of crime, disease, and moral corruption. Cities were described as war zones. The government was portrayed as an enemy that would separate families and destroy their pure way of life. The children never questioned this narrative because they had no point of reference. They had never seen a television, never heard a radio, never met another child from outside their family. Their world extended only to the property lines their father had established, marked by wooden posts driven deep into the ground. Beyond those posts lay forbidden territory. Medical care was limited to Thomas's military first aid training and a collection of veterinary supplies he purchased through mail-order catalogs using false names. When 8-year-old Sarah broke her arm falling from a tree in 1982, Thomas set the bone himself, using a technique he had learned treating injured soldiers in Vietnam. The bone healed incorrectly, leaving Sarah with limited mobility in her left arm for physical reminder of their isolation from proper medical care. The psychological control was even more sophisticated than the physical isolation. Thomas had developed what he called the rules, a complex system of behavioral expectations that governed every aspect of the children's lives. Speaking was limited to specific hours of the day. Questions about the outside world were forbidden and punished with solitary confinement in the root cellar. Any expression of curiosity about life beyond the property was treated as betrayal of the family unit. The children aged into teenagers, having never seen their own reflections in anything other than still water. Thomas had removed all mirrors from the house, claiming they encouraged vanity and self-obsession. They had never tasted processed food, never worn store-bought clothes, never heard music beyond the hymns their mother hummed while working. Their clothing was handmade from fabric their mother wove on a loom Thomas had built. Their shoes were crafted from leather, taken from their own cattle by 1987. The oldest child, Anna, was 17 years old. She had spent her entire life believing that her family's existence was normal, that all families lived in similar isolation. But something was beginning to change in Anna's understanding of the world. Small things at first, questions about why the sun seemed to set in the same direction every day, why birds flew in patterns that suggested destinations beyond their property, why sometimes at night she could see distant lights that her father claimed were dangerous signals, but that seemed too regular, too organized to be anything other than evidence of other people living structured lives. The breaking point came on an October morning when Anna was helping her father repair a fence along the eastern property line. As she hammered a loose board, she heard something that would change everything. The distant sound of children laughing. Not her siblings, but other children voices she didn't recognize. Coming from beyond the forbidden boundary, Thomas heard it too. His reaction was immediate and violent. He grabbed Anna's arm with such force that he left bruises that would last for weeks. "Evil spirits," he hissed, his eyes wide with the familiar paranoia that had defined their lives. "They're trying to tempt you away from salvation." But Anna knew what she had heard weren't evil spirits. They were children, real children, playing somewhere beyond the trees. For the first time in her 17 years of life, Anna began to understand that her father might be lying about the world beyond their property. That night, as her family slept, Anna made a decision that would expose the Cardells' secret to the outside world. She climbed out of the small window in the room she shared with her 3 younger sisters and, for the first time in her life, crossed the wooden posts that marked the boundary of her known universe. What she discovered on the other side would shatter everything she had been taught to believe about the world, about her family, and about herself. But more importantly, her escape would set in motion a series of events that would finally bring the invisible children of the Cardell family into the light and reveal the true extent of the psychological prison their parents had constructed around them. Anna's first steps beyond the family property revealed a truth so overwhelming that she nearly turned back. Less than half a mile through the woods, she discovered what her father had hidden from them for nearly 2 decades. A small rural community called Pine Ridge, complete with houses, streetlights, and the impossible sight of other families living normal lives. She crouched behind a tree, watching in amazement as children played in backyards, as parents called them in for dinner, as normal life unfolded in ways she had never imagined possible. The wasteland of corruption her father had described was actually a peaceful neighborhood where people seemed happy, healthy, and safe. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Everything she had been taught about the outside world was a lie. The isolation, the fear, the constant warnings about danger, all of it had been constructed to keep the family trapped within their father's delusions. Anna spent 3 hours watching this normal world before returning home. But the damage to her father's control was irreversible. Over the following weeks, she began questioning everything. Why were there no mirrors in their house when these people clearly had windows that reflected their images? Why did her father claim the government was evil when these people seemed to move freely without fear. Why had they never been allowed to explore when other children obviously could? Her questions became impossible to hide. Thomas noticed the change immediately. Anna's compliance, once absolute, began to crack. She hesitated before following orders. She looked toward the property boundaries with longing rather than fear. Most dangerously, she began asking her younger siblings questions that challenged their father's narrative. Thomas's response was swift and brutal. He constructed what he called the correction chamber, a windowless room in the basement where Anna was confined for asking questions. But isolation, which had once been Anna's entire world, no longer held the same power over her. She had seen proof that another world existed, and no amount of punishment could erase that knowledge. The discovery that would ultimately expose the Cardell family came from an unexpected source, a routine county survey updating property maps for tax purposes. In November 1987, surveyor Jim Patterson was using new aerial photography technology to map rural properties when he noticed something unusual about the Cardell land. The photographs showed clear signs of habitation gardens, livestock, buildings, but, according to county records, the property was listed as vacant land owned by someone named T. Mitchell, who had never filed any building permits or tax returns. Patterson reported the discrepancy to the county assessor's office, which triggered a routine investigation into potential tax evasion. When tax officials attempted to locate T.I. Mitchell, they discovered the identity was completely fabricated. The property deed led to a mail drop in a neighboring state that had been closed for 5 years. This administrative puzzle eventually reached the desk of social worker Margaret Chen, who specialized in cases involving off-grid families. Margaret had seen similar situations before: religious isolationists, survivalist families, people trying to escape legal troubles by disappearing into rural America. But something about the Cardell case felt different. The level of deception was too sophisticated, the isolation too complete. Margaret's first visit to the property in December 1987 was a carefully planned operation. She arrived with a county sheriff and a child welfare specialist, expecting to find perhaps a small family trying to avoid taxes or legal troubles. What they discovered was far more disturbing. Thomas answered the door with a shotgun in his hands and a story already prepared. He claimed to be a caretaker for the absent landowner. He denied that any children lived on the property, but Margaret could hear them young voices coming from inside the house, quickly hushed when the adults appeared. The standoff lasted for hours. Thomas refused to allow the officials inside without a warrant, but the sound of children was undeniable. Finally, Margaret used a legal provision that allowed immediate intervention when children's welfare was in apparent danger. She pushed past Thomas into the house and discovered a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her career. 11 children, ranging in age from 2 to 17, were huddled together in the main room. They were clean and appeared physically healthy, but their behavior was unlike anything Margaret had ever encountered. They didn't speak unless spoken to. They made no eye contact with the strangers. Most disturbing of all, when Margaret asked their names, they looked to their father for permission before answering. The oldest girl, Noah, was different. While her siblings cowered, Anna stepped forward and spoke words that would break open the case. "Please help us. We don't have names that count. We don't exist anywhere but here." The investigation that followed revealed the stunning scope of the Cardell family's isolation. None of the children had birth certificates. None had social security numbers. None had ever received medical care from a licensed doctor. None had ever attended school. According to every official record in the United States, they didn't exist. More shocking was the discovery of the psychological control system Thomas had developed. The children had been taught that speaking about their family to outsiders would result in their parents' death. They believed their father's claim that the government would separate them and place them in institutions where they would be abused and forgotten. Even after rescue, Many of the children were terrified that their cooperation with authorities would somehow harm their parents. The legal complications were unprecedented. How do you integrate 11 people into society when they have no legal identity? How do you provide services to children who don't officially exist? How do you prosecute parents for child abuse when the children were physically healthy and clearly loved their family despite the isolation? The process took months. Each child had to be assigned a social security number through a complex legal process. Birth certificates had to be created using estimated birth dates. Medical examinations revealed that while the children were malnourished and showed signs of vitamin deficiencies, they had been protected from serious physical harm. The psychological damage was more complex. The younger children adapted relatively quickly to outside society, but the older ones, especially Anna, struggled with what psychologists would later term reality adjustment disorder. They had lived their entire lives believing one version of reality, and accepting the truth meant acknowledging that their parents, whom they loved, had systematically lied to them about everything. Thomas and Ruth Cardell were charged with child endangerment, educational neglect, and fraud. During the trial, a disturbing picture emerged of two people whose fear of modern society had led them to imprison their own children in an elaborate fantasy of protection. Thomas testified that he believed he was saving his children from a world that would corrupt and destroy them. Ruth, who rarely spoke during the proceedings, maintained that they had done nothing wrong, that they had provided their children with love, safety, and moral guidance in a pure environment. The children were placed in foster care while the legal system struggled to determine their futures. The younger ones were eventually adopted by families who understood their unique backgrounds. The older children faced a more difficult transition. Anna, at 17, was deemed old enough to make her own decisions, but too psychologically damaged to live independently. She spent 2 years in therapeutic care learning basic life skills that most people take for granted: how to use a telephone, how to interact with strangers, how to navigate a world she had been taught to fear. The Cardell property was eventually sold to pay for the children's care and education. The house was torn down, but the land remains empty today. Local residents say it feels haunted, though whether by the spirits of the children who were imprisoned there, or by the ghosts of the normal childhood they never had, is unclear. Thomas Cardell died in prison in 1995, still maintaining that he had acted out of love for his children. Ruth was released after serving 8 years and disappeared into anonymity. She has never attempted to contact any of her children. Today, most of the Cardell children have built successful lives. They have families of their own, careers, and normal relationships. But they carry with them the unique trauma of having spent their formative years invisible to the world. Several have become advocates for child welfare, working to identify and help other families living in dangerous isolation. Donna, now in her 50s, works as a social worker specializing in cases involving isolated families. She has helped rescue dozens of children from situations similar to her own. When asked about her motivation, she gives a simple answer: every child deserves to exist in the world, not just in someone else's idea of what the world should be. The Cardell case led to changes in how authorities track off-grid families and monitor children's welfare in isolated communities. It exposed dangerous gaps in the systems designed to protect children and highlighted the fine line between religious freedom and child endangerment. But perhaps most importantly, it serves as a reminder that invisibility is not always a choice. Sometimes it's a prison constructed by people who claim to love you, and breaking free requires not just physical escape, but the psychological courage to accept that everything you've been taught about the world might be wrong. The 11 invisible children of the Cardell family are invisible no more. Their story stands as testimony to the resilience of the human spirit and the fundamental right of every child to exist fully in the world, not hidden from it, but embraced by it.
Thank you for watching another tale unfold here on NW Storytime. Every story hides a secret, and tonight you uncovered another one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep the secrets alive. Until next time, stay curious,